Glad you're here? Because tonight's tale is too strange to read alone. Picture this: you're standing on a wooden sidewalk in Sacramento, California, watching thick November clouds gather overhead like a gray woolen blanket someone's pulling too tight. The year is 1861, and you've just witnessed something that will make every future California disaster look like a gentle spring shower. The air tastes metallic, heavy with moisture that seems to press against your lungs with each breath. You can hear the distant rumble of something that isn't quite thunder. It's the sound of the Pacific Ocean, literally hanging in the sky, waiting to fall. You probably won't survive this. Well, statistically speaking, most people actually did survive the Great Flood of 1862, but your chances of keeping your home, your livestock, or your sanity intact, those odds aren't looking so favorable right about now. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love hearing from night owls and insomniacs around the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're living through November 1861, and the atmospheric river that's about to reshape California is gathering strength somewhere over the Pacific. Think of it as nature's fire hose, except the fire hose is 1,000 miles wide and filled with enough water to drown an entire state. The term atmospheric river won't be coined for another century, but you can feel its presence in the unusual warmth of the air, in the way your horses shift nervously in their stalls, in how the barometric pressure makes your bones ache. Sacramento in 1861 is a muddy, ambitious city of about 14,000 souls built on the confluence of the Sacramento and American rivers. It's a location that seemed brilliant during the gold rush, close to the mines, perfect for shipping, but now feels like someone chose to build a city inside a future lake. The streets are already perpetually muddy from the region's typical winter rains, and you've grown accustomed to lifting your hem or rolling up your trousers just to cross from one side of J Street to the other. The city's buildings reflect the optimism of the era grand hotels, like the Orleans, the state capitol building with its impressive dome, and countless wooden structures that sprouted like mushrooms during the gold fever. Many of these buildings sit on foundations that barely rise above the natural floodplain, because who could imagine water levels rising more than a few feet? The Sacramento River on a typical day flows peacefully about 20 feet below the city's street level. It's a reassuring sight that makes the approaching catastrophe feel impossible. You've heard whispers from ship captains arriving from San Francisco about unusual weather patterns forming far out at sea. Sailors speak of massive storm systems that seem to stretch beyond the horizon of waves that dwarf anything they've seen before. But these seem like tall tales from men who've spent too long at sea, breathing salt air and staring at endless water. After all, California's weather is predictable: wet winters, dry summers, and the occasional dramatic thunderstorm that provides more entertainment than actual danger. Historians still argue whether the indigenous peoples of the region possessed oral traditions warning of great floods, but the written records from white settlers contain no such warnings. The Maidu and other local tribes had lived in the Central Valley for thousands of years surely long enough to witness previous atmospheric river events, yet their knowledge remained largely inaccessible to the incoming settlers who would need it most. The morning of November 9th, 1861, brings an unusual stillness to the air. You notice how the birds seem agitated, how your dog refuses to venture far from the house, how even the mosquitoes that usually plague the Sacramento Delta seem to have vanished. There's something primal in the atmosphere, something that speaks to the deepest parts of human intuition about approaching danger. But you're a practical person living in a practical age. You've got work to do, bills to pay, and the everyday concerns of frontier life that don't pause for ominous weather signs. The idea that the sky might literally fall seems absurd, the stuff of children's fairy tales rather than adult reality. You go about your business, perhaps noting the unusual cloud formations, but certainly not preparing for the end of the world as you know it. The first drops arrive like scouts before an army fat and warm against your skin as you step outside on the morning of November 9th. But these aren't ordinary raindrops. They're the size of grapes hitting the dusty Sacramento streets with surprising force and creating small craters in the dirt. You pause under the wooden awning of Morrison's General Store, watching other pedestrians hurry past with newspapers held over their heads, and you can't shake the feeling that something fundamental has shifted in the natural order. By noon, the rain has settled into a steady downpour that seems to fall not from clouds, but from some inexhaustible celestial reservoir. You've lived through California winters before, but this feels different, heavier, more persistent, like the sky has developed a leak that can't be plugged. The Sacramento River, which flows 20 feet below street level on a normal day, has already begun to creep up its banks with an urgency that makes longtime residents pause their conversations and glance nervously toward the levees. The atmospheric river has locked onto the California coast like a massive conveyor belt of moisture stretching from the warm waters near Hawaii all the way to the Sierra Nevada mountains. Modern meteorologists would call this a pineapple express, but you experience it as an endless parade of storm systems that seem to regenerate themselves over the Pacific Ocean. Each wave of precipitation brings not just water, but an almost tropical warmth that prevents the high elevation snow from accumulating, properly turning what should be winter snowpack into immediate runoff. You watch from your window as the city's ambitious drainage systems, designed for normal California rainfall, begin to overwhelm within hours. The wooden gutters along K Street overflow first, sending brown water cascading into the intersections where it mingles with horse manure and the detritus of frontier life. The smell is immediate and overwhelming, a mixture of wet earth, animal waste, and something else, something organic and faintly sweet that you can't quite identify but will later recognize as the scent of a landscape drowning. 3 days into the deluge, you realize this isn't stopping. The rain falls with mechanical precision, as if someone has positioned a massive celestial watering can over California and forgotten to turn it off. Your neighbors begin to gather in small groups under covered porches, sharing increasingly wild theories about what might be causing this unprecedented weather. Some blame it on the Civil War raging back east, others on mining operations disturbing the natural balance, and a few insist it's divine punishment for the state's loose morals and rapid growth. Historians still argue Whether the storm systems of 1861, 1862 were truly unprecedented or simply the first to be documented by a literate population, but the geological evidence suggests floods of similar magnitude occurred roughly every 100 to 200 years. The indigenous peoples who lived in the Central Valley for millennia had surely witnessed such events, but their oral histories remained largely unrecorded by the settlers who desperately needed that knowledge. By the second week of November, the Sacramento River has risen 12 feet above its normal level, and you can no longer pretend this is a typical winter storm. The water moves with a purpose that seems almost malevolent, carrying entire trees' furniture and the occasional dead animal past your increasingly soggy city. The sound of rushing water has become the soundtrack of daily life, a constant reminder that the natural world has taken control of the conversation. You begin to notice the subtle signs of panic creeping into your community. At Palmer's Mercantile, the proprietor has quietly raised prices on lamp oil and preserved foods. People linger longer at the post office, hoping for news from the outside world that might explain what's happening. Children who normally play in the streets now press their faces against rain-streaked windows, watching the adult world grapple with something beyond their control. The levees that protect Sacramento were built for normal flood conditions, not for the biblical deluge now testing their limits. You can see men working frantically to reinforce the earthen barriers, with sandbags their movements becoming more desperate as the water continues to rise. The irony isn't lost on you that these same levees constructed to protect the city from the rivers may soon become the walls of a vast outdoor prison if the water overtops them. The atmospheric river shows no signs of weakening. Weather stations, though primitive by modern standards, record unprecedented amounts of precipitation falling across the entire state. In San Francisco, the rain falls in sheets so thick that visibility drops to mere yards. In the Sierra Nevada, the warm temperatures cause rapid snowmelt that adds to the already overwhelming runoff. Even Southern California, typically spared from northern storms, reports flooding from Los Angeles to San Diego. You find yourself developing new routines around the omnipresent water. Your boots never truly dry. Your clothing carries the persistent smell of dampness, and you've learned to navigate the city's increasingly treacherous streets by memory rather than sight. The wooden sidewalks have become slippery and dangerous, and more than one neighbor has taken a spectacular tumble into the muddy intersections. As November draws to a close, you realize you're witnessing something that will reshape California forever. The endless rain has transformed familiar landscapes into alien water worlds, and the comfortable assumption that humans control their environment has been thoroughly shattered. The atmospheric river continues its relentless assault, and December promises to bring even worse conditions. December arrives like a cruel joke, bringing not relief, but an intensification of the atmospheric river's assault that makes November's deluge seem like a gentle warm-up. You wake on December 1st to find water lapping at the bottom step of your front porch, and the realization hits you like a physical blow. Sacramento is no longer a city with a river running through it, but a collection of islands desperately trying to stay above an expanding inland sea. The Sacramento River has now risen 25 feet above its normal level, officially reaching flood stage and showing no signs of slowing its relentless climb. You can no longer see the river's original banks. Instead, water stretches to the horizon in every direction, punctuated only by the tops of fence posts, the occasional tree, and the roofs of single-story buildings that have already surrendered to the flood. The sound of rushing water has evolved from a gentle background murmur to a constant roar that makes normal conversation nearly impossible. Your neighbors, those who haven't already fled to higher ground, gather in small groups on second-story balconies and rooftops, sharing increasingly grim assessments of the situation. Mrs. Henderson, from the boarding house, reports that the water in her basement rose 3 feet overnight. The blacksmith's shop on L Street has been completely submerged, and you can see the forge's chimney poking above the water, like a tombstone marking the death of normalcy. The city's infrastructure begins to collapse with almost comedic timing. The wooden sidewalks, already saturated beyond their capacity, start to buckle and float away in large sections, creating impromptu rafts that drift past your window, carrying debris from upstream. The gas lighting system fails street by street as water infiltrates the underground pipes, plunging entire neighborhoods into darkness that makes the flooded city feel even more apocalyptic. By mid-December, you're forced to accept that Sacramento has become Venice, California, except without the charm, the gondolas, or any reasonable expectation that this is a temporary situation. You've learned to navigate the city by boat, joining the flotilla of makeshift vessels that have become the primary means of transportation. Rowboats, canoes, hastily constructed rafts, and even doors torn from their hinges serve as the new public transit system for a city that no longer has streets. The state government, theoretically the most powerful institution in California, finds itself as helpless as any other flood victim. Governor Leland Stanford's mansion sits on slightly higher ground than most of the city, but even he watches nervously as the water continues its inexorable rise. The state capitol building, that symbol of California's growing influence and prosperity, has water lapping at its front steps, and the basement chambers, where important documents are stored, have become an underwater archive. Historians still argue whether the decision to evacuate the state government was made too late or whether any earlier action could have prevented the chaos that followed, but by Christmas 1861, it becomes clear that California's seat of power is about to become California's newest lake. The governor's advisors, many of whom are practical men with business interests throughout the flooded Central Valley, begin to whisper about the unthinkable abandoning the capital entirely. You witness scenes that would be comical if they weren't so desperate. A traveling merchant floats down what used to be J Street in a bathtub, his sample cases balanced precariously on his lap. 3 chickens perch on the roof of the post office, squawking indignantly at their transformed world. The local newspaper, the Sacramento Union, continues to publish, despite having to move its printing press to the second floor, and their headlines grow increasingly surreal. Water continues to rise, gives way to no end in sight, and finally to government considers relocation. The human cost becomes impossible to ignore. You watch families abandon their homes with whatever possessions they can carry, wading through chest-deep water toward higher ground that seems to shrink with each passing day. The elderly and infirm pose particular challenges. How do you evacuate a bedridden grandmother when the streets have become rivers? Some families make the heartbreaking decision to leave behind not just their worldly possessions, but their livestock, their pets, and sometimes even their weakest members. The atmospheric river shows no mercy, continuing to pump moisture from the Pacific Ocean with mechanical precision. Each day brings new records for rainfall, and the warm temperatures prevent the Sierra Nevada snowpack from accumulating, properly turning what should be stored winter precipitation into immediate runoff that feeds the already overwhelming flood. You begin to understand that you're not just experiencing bad weather, you're witnessing a complete reorganization of California's geography. Food becomes scarce as supply lines collapse. The trains that normally bring goods from San Francisco can't reach the flooded city, and the roads have become impassable rivers. You join the growing number of residents who have learned to fish from their second-story windows, hoping to catch something edible from the murky water that now serves as Sacramento's main thoroughfare. The irony isn't lost on you that in a city surrounded by water, finding clean drinking water has become a daily challenge. By the end of December, you realize that the Sacramento you knew has ceased to exist. The city that emerged from the gold rush as a symbol of California's limitless potential has been transformed into a cautionary tale about the folly of building in flood-prone areas. The water continues to rise, and January promises to bring the final chapter of Sacramento's brief reign as California's capital. January 1862 arrives with the bureaucratic precision of a government office closing for the day, except the office is the entire state of California, and the closing might be permanent. You watch from your second-story window as Governor Leland Stanford's personal steamboat, the Antelope, churns through what used to be Capitol Park, its paddle wheels churning up muddy water that now reaches the first-floor windows of the state capitol building. The sight is so surreal that you actually laugh out loud, a slightly hysterical sound that echoes off the water and seems to mock the very concept of human authority. The decision to evacuate the state government wasn't made lightly, but it also wasn't made particularly well. You witness the chaotic scene as legislators, clerks, and assorted political hangers-on attempt to load essential documents, furniture, and the symbolic trappings of power onto whatever floating vessels they can commandeer. The Great Seal of California, that weighty bronze symbol of state authority, nearly ends up at the bottom of the Sacramento River when the rowboat carrying it takes on water near the governor's mansion. Stanford himself cuts a somewhat ridiculous figure as he attempts to maintain gubernatorial dignity while being paddled through the flooded streets like some kind of executive gondolier. His top hat sits slightly askew, and his normally immaculate beard drips with the same muddy water that has claimed his capital city. You can't help but notice that even California's most powerful man looks small and vulnerable when nature decides to rearrange the landscape. The logistics of moving an entire state government prove more complicated than anyone anticipated. Essential records that seemed so important when filed away in dry basements now float past your window like soggy confetti. The state treasury, thankfully stored in a San Francisco bank, remains secure, but the accumulated paperwork of California's brief 13-year existence as a state begins to dissolve in the floodwaters. Future historians will curse this watery chaos when they discover that many crucial early documents simply vanished into the atmospheric river's embrace. You follow the governmental exodus as it makes its way down the flooded Sacramento River toward San Francisco Bay. The journey that normally takes a few hours by train now becomes a multi-day aquatic adventure involving steamboats, barges, and the occasional improvised raft. Some legislators displaying the same practical wisdom that led them to build a capitol in a floodplain insist on bringing their personal furniture and complete files, turning the evacuation into a floating garage sale. San Francisco, perched safely on its hills above the bay, welcomes the refugee government with a mixture of sympathy and barely concealed smugness. The city's newspapers, never shy about pointing out Sacramento's shortcomings, run headlines that manage to be both supportive and sarcastic. Golden Gate City opens arms to waterlogged lawmakers, and Sacramento politicians finally all wet. You can imagine the San Francisco socialites hosting tea parties where they discuss the unfortunate flooding while secretly pleased that their city has proven its superiority. The temporary capital establishes itself in whatever buildings can accommodate the displaced bureaucracy. The governor sets up shop in a borrowed office building while the legislature meets in rented halls that smell of tobacco and previous tenants. The California State Library, a modest but growing collection of books and documents, finds refuge in a Montgomery Street warehouse where librarians work by candlelight to assess water damage and catalog their losses. Historians still argue whether the relocation was legally proper or whether Stanford exceeded his authority by essentially moving the seat of government without legislative approval, but such constitutional niceties seem absurd when the alternative is conducting state business from rowboats. The pragmatic reality of governing a flooded state takes precedence over legal technicalities, though future scholars will spend decades debating the precedent this sets. The human drama of the evacuation reveals both the best and worst of political behavior. You hear stories of legislators who abandoned their posts at the first sign of rising water, while others remained in Sacramento until the last possible moment, helping coordinate rescue efforts and maintain some semblance of order. Assemblyman John Bidwell, who will later become famous for other reasons, reportedly spent 3 days helping evacuate families from the flooded city before finally accepting passage to San Francisco. The symbolic weight of abandoning the capital resonates throughout California. Sacramento wasn't just a city, it was a statement about the state's ambitions, its growth, and its defiance of natural limitations. The gold rush had made California rich and confident, and Sacramento embodied that confidence by rising from the marshy confluence of two rivers to become the seat of political power. Now that same water that gave the city life has reclaimed it, forcing a humbling recognition of nature's ultimate authority. Communication with the outside world becomes increasingly difficult as telegraph lines fail and mail service collapses. You realize that California has become temporarily cut off from the rest of the Union, an isolation that feels particularly acute given the Civil War raging in the East. The state that prided itself on rapid communication with the outside world now finds itself as isolated as it was during the earliest days of the gold rush. The evacuation marks more than just a temporary inconvenience. It represents a fundamental shift in California's relationship with its environment. The state that had seemed to master nature through technology and determination now finds itself literally adrift, its leaders governing from exile, while their intended capital disappears beneath an inland sea. The atmospheric river has accomplished what no human enemy could. It has dissolved the very foundations of California's political identity. February brings a cruel stability to your new aquatic existence. The water stops rising, but it also stops receding, leaving you trapped in a Venice-like maze of flooded streets that have become the new normal. You've developed skills you never imagined needing, judging water depth by the color of the surface, identifying which rooftops offer the safest temporary shelter, and most importantly, distinguishing between the sound of approaching rescue boats and the more ominous splash of debris that might crash into your improvised shelter. Your daily routine has been completely restructured around the omnipresent water. You wake each morning and immediately check the water level against the pencil mark you've scratched into your bedroom wall, a makeshift flood gauge that has become more important than any clock or calendar. Breakfast consists of whatever canned goods you manage to salvage from your flooded pantry, heated over a small fire you've learned to build on your roof using furniture legs and pages from water-damaged books. The social fabric of Sacramento has reorganized itself around elevation and access to boats. Your neighbor's people you might have barely acknowledged during normal times have become your closest allies in this strange new world. Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down has proven invaluable. She somehow managed to save her entire flock of chickens, and fresh eggs have become a currency more valuable than gold. The banker who used to intimidate you with his formal manner now sheepishly asks to borrow your fishing line. His financial expertise, utterly useless in a world where the primary concern is catching dinner from your bedroom window. Food procurement has become a daily adventure that combines foraging, fishing, and occasional acts of questionable legality. You've learned to identify which floating debris might contain edible supplies and which submerged buildings might still harbor uncontaminated provisions. The general store's roof has become a trading post where survivors exchange goods with the desperation of shipwrecked sailors. A can of peaches might trade for a dry blanket, a bottle of whiskey for a fishing hook, and everyone has stories about the supplies they lost to the water. The psychological toll of living in a flooded city reveals itself in unexpected ways. You notice how people's conversations have changed. Nobody discusses the future anymore, only the immediate challenges of survival. Children who haven't seen dry land in months develop a peculiar fearlessness around water that simultaneously impresses and terrifies their parents. Some adults conversely refuse to leave their upper story sanctuaries, developing an almost phobic response to the idea of entering the water that surrounds them. Healthcare in this flooded world becomes a nightmare of improvisation and desperation. Dr. Morrison, the town's only physician, has set up a makeshift clinic on the second floor of the hotel, but getting sick or injured patients to his care requires boat transportation that isn't always available. You witness the heartbreaking sight of families paddling frantically through the flooded streets, trying to reach medical help for loved ones whose conditions can't wait for the water to recede. The atmospheric river's effects extend far beyond mere inconvenience. They've created a public health crisis that authorities are woefully unprepared to address. The floodwater, a mixture of river overflow sewage and urban runoff, breeds diseases that spread through the crowded refugee communities. cholera, typhoid, and dysentery become constant threats in a city where clean water is scarce and sanitation systems have completely collapsed. You've developed an intimate knowledge of your city's underwater geography, learning to navigate by the tops of fence posts, the peaks of roofs, and the occasional tree that still breaks the surface. The familiar landmarks of your normal life have been transformed into a surreal aquatic landscape where the church steeple serves as a lighthouse and the courthouse dome has become a popular fishing spot. It's simultaneously fascinating and deeply unsettling to row a boat down what used to be your daily walking route to work. The economic implications of the flood become clear as you watch your community's entire commercial structure dissolve into the muddy water. The general store, the blacksmith shop, the newspaper office, all the businesses that formed the backbone of Sacramento's economy have either been destroyed or rendered temporarily useless. Some merchants attempt to continue operating from boats or second-story windows, but the normal flow of commerce has been thoroughly disrupted. Historians still argue whether the extended flooding was caused primarily by continued rainfall or by the slow drainage of water from the vast inland sea that the Central Valley had become, but from your perspective, the cause matters less than the seemingly permanent nature of your predicament. Each day brings the same watery landscape, the same challenges of finding food and shelter, and the same growing uncertainty about whether normal life will ever return. The social dynamics of your flooded community reveal both human resilience and the fragility of civilized behavior. You've seen neighbors risk their lives to save strangers sharing their last piece of bread with families they've never met. You've also witnessed the darker side of desperation, people hoarding supplies, price gouging, and occasionally resorting to theft when they believe no one is watching. The flood has stripped away many of the social conventions that normally govern behavior, revealing the raw human nature that lurks beneath civilized society. Sleep becomes a luxury that must be carefully managed around the realities of your aquatic existence. You've learned to tie yourself to secure fixtures to prevent rolling into the water during the night, and you've developed the ability to wake instantly at any unusual sound, a skill that proves essential when floating debris threatens to crash into your shelter or when the water level shifts unexpectedly. March arrives with the stench of death floating on the receding waters, and you discover that California's Great Flood has claimed far more than buildings and dreams. It has become the largest livestock massacre in American history. The smell hits you first, a sweet, sick odor that seems to cling to everything: your clothes, your hair, even the water you're forced to drink. You realize with growing horror that the dark objects floating past your window aren't logs or debris, but the bloated carcasses of cattle, horses, sheep, and pigs that once represented the agricultural wealth of the Central Valley. The numbers are staggering and heartbreaking. Across California, an estimated 200,000 cattle have drowned in the flood, along with countless thousands of sheep, horses, and other livestock. You watch from your rooftop as entire herds float past like a macabre parade, their legs sticking up at unnatural angles from the murky water. Some animals still alive but trapped on small islands of higher ground bellow pitifully as they wait for rescue that will never come, or for the water to claim them too. The economic devastation is immediate and crushing. California's ranchers many of whom had invested their life savings in livestock find themselves bankrupt overnight. The cattle that survived the initial flooding often die from exposure disease or starvation as they crowd together on whatever dry land remains. You hear stories of ranchers who lost everything, thousands of head of cattle that represented decades of careful breeding and investment, and who now face financial ruin that will take generations to recover from. The Central Valley, California's agricultural heartland has been transformed into a vast cemetery of drowned animals. The water that once nourished the grasslands now carries the decomposing remains of the livestock that fed on them. You begin to understand that you're witnessing not just a natural disaster, but the complete collapse of California's rural economy, a catastrophe that will reshape the state's agricultural patterns for decades to come. The psychological impact on the ranchers proves almost as devastating as the economic losses. These are men who prided themselves on their ability to read weather patterns, to protect their herds, and to work in harmony with the natural cycles of drought and plenty. Now they stand on hilltops, watching their life's work float past, as carrion their expertise rendered useless by a meteorological event beyond anyone's prediction or control. You witness scenes that seem borrowed from biblical apocalypse. A magnificent bull, probably worth more than most people's annual income, drifts past your window with ravens perched on its swollen flanks. A flock of sheep, their wool still white despite the muddy water, moves in a tight cluster like a floating island of the dead. The horses are perhaps the most heartbreaking, these intelligent animals that once served as partners to their human owners now bob lifelessly in the current, their manes flowing like seagrass in the contaminated water. The disposal of so many animal carcasses creates a public health crisis that authorities are completely unprepared to address. The decomposing livestock pollute the water supply, creating perfect breeding conditions for disease. You learn to identify the different stages of decomposition by sight and smell knowledge that proves grimly useful for determining which areas of the floodwater might be safer to navigate than others. Some enterprising individuals attempt to salvage what they can from the floating carcasses, but the logistical challenges are overwhelming. How do you process thousands of dead animals when your processing facilities are underwater? How do you preserve meat when you have no ice and no reliable way to transport it to markets? Most of the carcasses simply drift downstream toward San Francisco Bay, where they create maritime hazards and further contaminate the water supply. Historians still argue whether the massive livestock die-off was preventable or whether the speed and scale of the flooding made evacuation impossible, but contemporary accounts suggest that many ranchers simply couldn't believe the water would rise as high as it did. The psychological tendency to normalize even extreme conditions meant that many livestock owners waited too long to move their animals to higher ground, assuming the flood would peak and recede like normal seasonal flooding. The wildlife impact extends beyond domestic animals to the native species that called the Central Valley home. Deer, elk, rabbits, and countless smaller animals also perish in the flood, their bodies adding to the grim flotilla of death that flows past your window. The entire ecosystem of the valley has been disrupted with consequences that will ripple through the food chain for years to come. You begin to understand that the Great Flood represents more than just an inconvenience or even a disaster. It's a complete reset of California's agricultural economy. The ranchers who lose their herds won't simply rebuild. Many will leave the state entirely seeking opportunities in places where the ground stays dry and the rivers stay in their banks. The vacant land they leave behind will eventually be claimed by different kinds of agriculture, by different kinds of people, creating a California that would be unrecognizable to its pre-flood inhabitants. The floating graveyard of livestock serves as a constant reminder of nature's power to overturn human plans and investments. You watch wealthy ranchers reduced to begging for basic supplies, their social status dissolved as completely as their economic foundation. The flood has democratized suffering, making equals of everyone who finds themselves trapped in this watery wasteland. April brings the cruel mathematics of disaster, not just the counting of lost livestock or destroyed property, but the impossible task of counting the human dead in a state too overwhelmed to maintain proper records. You realize with growing unease that the most tragic aspect of California's Great Flood might be how many people simply vanished without leaving any trace, their stories disappearing into the muddy water along with their bodies. The official death toll, when historians finally attempt to calculate it decades later, will prove frustratingly vague. Some estimates suggest several hundred deaths. Others claim the number reached into the thousands. But the truth is that California in 1862 lacks the bureaucratic infrastructure to accurately count its flood victims. You witness this administrative chaos firsthand as local officials themselves, refugees from the flood struggle, to maintain any semblance of record keeping while governing from temporary shelters and borrowed buildings. The categories of the uncounted haunt your daily existence. There are the miners working remote claims in the Sierra foothills, men who came to California alone and whose disappearance might not be noticed for months or years. There are the Chinese immigrants working on railroad construction whose deaths often go unrecorded even in normal times due to language barriers and social prejudice. There are the Native Americans already marginalized by California's brutal policies, whose flood-related deaths receive no official recognition whatsoever. You encounter families searching desperately for missing relatives, carrying soggy photographs and descriptions of people who might have drowned, might have fled to higher ground, or might have simply decided to leave California entirely. The Murphy family from J Street has been looking for their elderly father for 3 weeks, paddling from one refugee camp to another with a daguerreotype that shows a dignified man in a formal coat, a man who might be anywhere or nowhere in this transformed landscape. The transient nature of California's population in 1862 makes the accounting even more impossible. This is still a frontier state where people arrive and depart with little official notice, where entire communities can spring up around a mining claim and disappear when the gold runs out. The flood has simply accelerated this natural mobility, but it's also erased the informal networks of communication that usually keep track of who's where and who's missing. You learn to recognize the particular grief of those who've lost someone to the flood. It's different from ordinary bereavement because it lacks the finality of a body, a funeral, or even certainty about what happened. Mrs. Chen from the laundry searches the floating debris for any sign of her husband's distinctive blue jacket, while the Andersons row through the flooded streets, calling their teenage son's name, hoping he might hear them from whatever shelter he's found. The social implications of the uncounted dead extend beyond immediate grief to legal and practical complications that will persist for years. How do you settle the estate of someone who might be dead or might have simply left the state? How do you remarry when your spouse's body was never found? How do you claim inheritance when the will might have drowned along with the person who wrote it? The flood has created a legal limbo that will keep California's courts busy for decades. Some deaths receive attention precisely because they're so unusual or dramatic. The story of the steamboat captain who died trying to rescue a family trapped on their roof becomes local legend, while the unnamed Chinese workers who drowned in their camp receive no memorial beyond the whispered stories their surviving countrymen tell. The hierarchy of whose death matters reflects the broader social prejudices of 1862 California, where some lives are considered more valuable than others. Historians still argue whether the low official death toll reflects the actual impact of the flood or simply the inadequacy of record keeping in a frontier state. But your daily experience suggests that the true human cost will never be fully known. Every refugee camp holds stories of people who haven't been seen since the water rose. Every boat captain has tales of bodies glimpsed floating downstream, and every family has missing relatives whose fate remains uncertain. The mass graves that begin appearing around the edges of the floodwater tell part of the story hastily dug trenches where the bodies that are recovered receive burial without ceremony or individual markers. You watch these grim processions with a mixture of sorrow and relief, knowing that at least these victims will receive some form of recognition, unlike the countless others who simply vanished into the atmospheric river's embrace. The psychological impact of the uncounted dead weighs heavily on the survivors. You find yourself scanning every group of refugees for familiar faces, hoping to spot someone you feared was lost. The absence of closure creates a persistent anxiety that affects entire communities. How do you move forward when you don't know who's actually gone and who might still be out there somewhere, waiting for rescue or recovery? The flood has created what modern disaster experts would recognize as a classic problem of missing persons versus presumed dead categories that blur together in the chaos of a major disaster. You realize that California's Great Flood has produced not just immediate casualties, but a generation of people who will spend years wondering about the fate of their missing loved ones, unable to fully grieve or fully hope. May arrives with the slow, painful revelation of just how thoroughly the Great Flood has rewritten California's geography, and you begin to comprehend the staggering scope of destruction as the waters finally recede enough to reveal the transformed landscape beneath. The statistics, when they're finally compiled by shell-shocked surveyors and insurance adjusters, will show that approximately 1/4 of all taxable property in California has been destroyed or severely damaged, a level of devastation that makes the flood not just a natural disaster, but an economic apocalypse. You wade through the retreating waters of Sacramento, your boots squelching in the thick mud that has replaced what used to be familiar streets, and discover a city that exists more in memory than in reality. The elegant hotels that once hosted visiting dignitaries and wealthy travelers now stand as hollow shells, their ground floors filled with debris that ranges from furniture to dead animals to the unidentifiable detritus of a civilization temporarily underwater. The Orleans Hotel, which prided itself on fine dining and imported furnishings, now looks like a monument to hubris, its once grand lobby buried under 3 feet of river silt. The residential neighborhoods tell stories of individual catastrophe multiplied across thousands of families. You examine houses that have been lifted completely off their foundations and deposited blocks away from where they belonged, their contents scattered like the pieces of a giant's jigsaw puzzle. The Hendersons' parlor piano somehow ended up in the Johnsons' backyard, while Mrs. Patterson's prized rose garden now decorates the roof of the Methodist church. Personal belongings that represented lifetimes of accumulation and sentiment have been redistributed by the flood's democratic chaos. The agricultural devastation extends far beyond the livestock losses you witnessed earlier. The Central Valley's fertile soil, built up over centuries of seasonal flooding, has been scoured away in many areas and deposited in others, creating a patchwork landscape where some fields have been buried under feet of sterile sand while others have been stripped down to bedrock. You encounter farmers standing in fields that no longer exist, trying to process the fact that their land has been literally washed away to some unknown destination downstream. The infrastructure damage proves particularly devastating because it affects the entire state's ability to function and recover. Bridges that took years to build have been reduced to twisted metal and scattered timbers. Roads that connected communities have been erased, leaving isolated settlements that might as well be on separate continents. The railroad lines that linked California to the rest of the nation have been twisted into abstract sculptures of bent rails and buried stations. You discover that the flood has been particularly cruel to California's libraries, schools, and cultural institutions, the repositories of knowledge and civilization that took years to establish. The California State Library's collection, hastily evacuated to San Francisco, represents only a fraction of what was lost. Local libraries, school buildings, and newspaper archives have been destroyed, taking with them irreplaceable records of the state's brief but intense history. The psychological impact of surveying this destruction creates a peculiar form of grief that combines personal loss with a broader sense of civilizational failure. You find yourself mourning not just your own ruined possessions, but the collective dreams and ambitions that the destroyed buildings represented. The grand courthouse that symbolized California's commitment to law and order now stands as a monument to nature's indifference to human institutions. Some structures survive in ways that seem almost miraculous, creating an eerie landscape of random preservation amid widespread destruction. The Catholic Church on K Street emerges from the flood virtually intact, while the more substantial brick buildings around it have been reduced to rubble. These arbitrary survivals become focal points for communities trying to rebuild, offering both practical shelter and symbolic hope that not everything has been lost. The economic ripple effects of the destruction extend far beyond California's borders. San Francisco's banks, which financed much of the state's development, face massive losses as property values collapse and loans go unpaid. Insurance companies, many of them based in eastern cities, discover that their policies never contemplated flooding on this scale. Some companies simply declare bankruptcy rather than face the impossible task of paying claims that exceed their total assets. Historians still argue whether the level of destruction was inevitable given the scale of the flooding, or whether better building practices might have reduced the damage, but the evidence suggests that California's rapid development during the gold rush prioritized speed over durability. Buildings designed to be erected quickly and cheaply proved utterly inadequate when confronted with nature's full fury. The human stories embedded in the destruction reveal both the arbitrariness of disaster and the resilience of people faced with complete loss. You meet families who have lost everything but somehow maintain their optimism, as well as others who seem broken by losses that might seem minor compared to their neighbors' catastrophes. The flood has redistributed not just property, but hope itself, creating a complex emotional landscape that will take years to fully comprehend. The cleanup efforts reveal the true scale of the challenge facing California. How do you rebuild a state when the basic infrastructure of civilization has been washed away? How do you restore confidence in a place that has proven so vulnerable to natural forces? The answers to these questions will shape California's development for generations, creating a state that is both more resilient and more cautious than the one the flood destroyed. June brings the most disturbing revelation of all California's remarkable ability to forget its own near-death experience, as if collective amnesia might somehow prevent future disasters by erasing the memory of past ones. You watch with growing bewilderment as newspapers begin running articles about recovery and rebuilding that barely mention the flood's causes, focusing instead on the entrepreneurial opportunities created by so much destruction. It's as if the state has decided that the best way to deal with trauma is to pretend it never happened. The speed of this forgetting seems almost supernatural. Within months of the water's receding, you hear civic leaders discussing plans for an even grander Sacramento, complete with more elaborate buildings and expanded development in the same flood-prone areas that were just devastated. The lessons that should have been learned from the atmospheric river's assault about the dangers of building in floodplains, about the need for better drainage systems, about the folly of ignoring natural warning signs, are being systematically ignored in favor of a return to business as usual. Real estate promoters, displaying the same optimistic blindness that characterized the gold rush, began advertising the flood zone as premium riverside property with rich fertile soil. You read advertisements that describe the recently flooded areas as perfectly situated for agricultural development, without mentioning that this fertility comes from the decomposed remains of thousands of drowned animals, or that the riverside location nearly became a permanent lake just months earlier. The psychological mechanisms of this forgetting reveal themselves in everyday conversations. Your neighbors, the same people who huddled with you on rooftops and shared their last cans of beans during the worst of the flooding, now speak of the event as if it were a minor inconvenience rather than a life-altering catastrophe. Remember that wet winter, they say, as if the transformation of California into an inland sea was comparable to a particularly heavy rainstorm. The state government, now returned to Sacramento, despite the obvious risks, makes only minimal changes to address the flood hazards. The levee system receives some repairs, but no fundamental redesign. Building codes remain largely unchanged, and there's no serious discussion of relocating the capital to higher ground. The politicians who fled to San Francisco in boats just months earlier now debate budgets and policies as if the flood were an aberration that could never happen again. You begin to understand that California's amnesia about the Great Flood is not accidental but functional, a necessary psychological defense mechanism that allows people to rebuild in places where rational analysis would suggest permanent abandonment. The alternative to forgetting would be to acknowledge that much of California's most valuable land is fundamentally uninhabitable, a recognition that would undermine the entire economic and social structure of the state. The cultural implications of this willful forgetting extend beyond immediate practical concerns to shape California's entire relationship with natural disasters. The state develops a pattern of treating each catastrophe as unprecedented and unforeseeable rather than as part of a predictable cycle of natural events. This mindset will influence California's response to earthquakes, wildfires, and droughts for generations to come. The indigenous peoples of California, whose oral traditions might have contained warnings about great floods, find their knowledge even more marginalized after the disaster. The flood should have created interest in traditional ecological knowledge, but instead it reinforces the settler conviction that native peoples have nothing valuable to contribute to modern civilization. The opportunity to learn from cultures that survived previous atmospheric river events is lost to the same amnesia that erases the flood's lessons. You witness the creation of new myths designed to replace uncomfortable memories. The flood becomes in popular retelling a story of human heroism and resilience rather than natural power and human vulnerability. The focus shifts to tales of dramatic rescues and community cooperation, while the fundamental questions about why people built a capital in a flood zone remain unexamined. The economic pressures driving this amnesia prove irresistible. Too much money has been invested in flood-prone areas to abandon them based on a single catastrophic event. Banks, insurance companies, and developers have powerful incentives to minimize the flood's significance and to encourage continued development in areas that logic suggests should be left empty. The immediate financial costs of remembering the flood's lessons exceed the hypothetical future costs of ignoring them. Historians still argue whether California's quick recovery from the Great Flood represents admirable resilience or dangerous denial, but the pattern established in 1862 will repeat itself throughout the state's history. Each disaster will be treated as unique and unpredictable. Each rebuilding effort will recreate the same vulnerabilities, and each new generation will discover that nature's memory is longer and more reliable than human memory. The few voices calling for serious flood mitigation measures find themselves marginalized as pessimists and obstructionists. You hear these warnings dismissed as the complaints of people who lack faith in California's future or who don't understand the state's unique character. The message is clear. Good Californians forget disasters and focus on opportunities, while only outsiders and malcontents dwell on past catastrophes. This pattern of forgetting extends to the most basic level of record keeping. Official documents about the flood are filed away, and forgotten maps showing the extent of flooding are lost or ignored, and the testimonies of survivors are treated as interesting anecdotes rather than essential planning documents. California is systematically erasing the evidence of its own vulnerability, creating a dangerous precedent for future disasters. July 1862 brings the final, most chilling revelation of your journey through California's Great Flood. The scientific certainty that this catastrophe will happen again, and the growing realization that modern California is even more vulnerable than the frontier state that barely survived the atmospheric river of 1861 to 1862. You discover that what you've lived through isn't a once-in-a-lifetime disaster, but a recurring natural phenomenon that geological evidence suggests strikes California roughly every 100 to 200 years, with the mathematical precision of a cosmic clockwork that doesn't care about human schedules or preparedness. The atmospheric river that devastated your state has a name now assigned by modern meteorologists who study these phenomena with instruments and understanding that would seem like magic to your 1862 contemporaries. They call it an arc storm atmospheric river, 1000 is, indicating a storm with a 1 in 1000 chance of occurring in any given year, which sounds reassuring until you realize that over a 200-year period, the odds approach certainty. Scientists have traced the signatures of previous megafloods in sediment cores, tree rings, and geological formations, creating a timeline of destruction that stretches back thousands of years. You learn that the Great Flood you survived was actually relatively modest compared to some of the prehistoric atmospheric river events that shaped California's landscape. The flood of 1605, recorded in Native American oral traditions and confirmed by geological evidence, may have been significantly larger. The flood of 1750 left debris lines that suggest water levels even higher than those you witnessed. The implication is sobering. You didn't survive the big one, but merely the latest in a series of increasingly powerful demonstrations of nature's authority over human ambition. The modern California that exists in the shadow of the next inevitable arc storm is far more vulnerable than the frontier state you inhabited. The Central Valley, which became an inland sea in 1862, now supports 6 million people and produces 40% of America's fruits and vegetables. The cities built on former floodplains now house millions of residents who have no memory of when their neighborhoods were underwater. The infrastructure, airports, hospitals, power plants that modern life depends on sites in exactly the same flood zones that proved so dangerous in 1862. The economic implications of the next great flood dwarf anything you witnessed in the 1860s. Modern California's economy, valued in the trillions of dollars, depends on the assumption that the Central Valley will remain dry, that Silicon Valley will stay above water, and that the complex networks of transportation and communication that connect California to the world will continue to function. A repeat of the 1862 flood would create economic disruption that would ripple through global markets and affect every person on Earth. The psychological preparation for the next arc storm reveals the same patterns of denial and amnesia that you observed in the aftermath of the 1862 flood. Real estate developers continue to build in flood-prone areas. Insurance companies calculate risks based on recent history rather than geological time, and politicians focus on short-term economic concerns rather than long-term disaster planning. The human capacity for optimism bias, which helped California recover from the Great Flood, now threatens to make the next one even more catastrophic. You realize that the atmospheric river you survived was nature's way of teaching California about its own vulnerability, but the lesson has been largely ignored. The state's response to flood risks remains focused on engineering solutions, bigger levees, better drainage systems, more sophisticated forecasting, rather than the fundamental changes in land use and development patterns that the geological record suggests are necessary. California continues to bet against nature, confident that human ingenuity can overcome natural forces. The climate scientists who study arc storms warn that global warming may make these events more frequent and more intense. The atmospheric rivers that bring life giving rain to California in normal years may become more powerful and more persistent as the planet warms, creating conditions that could make the 1862 flood seem mild by comparison. The same Pacific Ocean that generated the atmospheric river you survived is now warmer and more energetic, capable of producing weather events that exceed anything in the historical record. Historians still argue whether the Great Flood of 1862 was truly unusual or simply the first to be documented by a literate population. But the geological evidence suggests that California's wet periods follow natural cycles that operate on timescales far longer than human memory. The state's current dry period, which has lasted for most of the 20th and 21st centuries, may be the anomaly rather than the norm. The California that millions of people now call home may be built on a climatological exception rather than a reliable pattern. The emergency planners who study the next arc storm face an impossible challenge. How do you prepare for a disaster that could affect 25 million people, flood an area the size of several states, and disrupt the economy of the entire Pacific Rim? The logistics of evacuating the Central Valley, providing emergency shelter for millions of flood victims, and maintaining essential services during months of flooding exceed the capacity of any emergency management system ever created. The Great Flood of 1862 represents more than historical curiosity. It's a preview of California's future, a reminder that the state's remarkable growth and prosperity exist at the mercy of natural forces that operate according to their own timeline. The atmospheric river that transformed your world into an inland sea was not a unique event, but a regular feature of California's climate, as predictable as the seasons and as inevitable as the tides. The only uncertainty is not whether the next great flood will come, but whether the California that faces it will be better prepared than the frontier state that barely survived the last one. Now, as our journey through the Great Flood draws to a close, let the weight of those floodwaters settle gently into memory. You've witnessed California's greatest natural disaster, lived through months of biblical flooding, and seen an entire state transformed by the power of an atmospheric river. The water has receded, the survivors have rebuilt, and the lessons have been largely forgotten, but the cycle continues. Somewhere over the Pacific, conditions are slowly aligning for the next great flood, the next test of human resilience against nature's patient power. The atmospheric river that brought such devastation to your 1862 world sleeps now, but like all sleeping giants, it will eventually awaken. Close your eyes, listen to the gentle sound of rain against your window, and remember that in California, every drop of water carries the memory of floods past and the promise of floods to come. Sweet dreams, and may your levees hold strong through the night.